Defense Secretary Robert Gates has reluctantly agreed to $70 billion worth of cuts from the defense budget for the years spanning 2012 to 2015. This has defense hawks screaming that we've thrown in the towel, that we might as well just surrender to al-Qaeda. But even with the cuts, the defense budget is still 20% larger than during the Bush years and larger than the average years in the Cold War era. Surely, fighting a few thousand terrorists should cost less than an arms race against a power-hungry, nuclear arms-bearing Soviet Union. Here to try and make sense of this defense budget squabbling are my freedom fighters, Fox Business Network contributor, my colleague and friend Charles Payne, radio host and Freedom Watch regular Nancy Skinner, and director of economic research for the Reason Foundation, Anthony Randazzo. Anthony, to you first. Is there the stomach in the Congress to cut this third rail, this sacred cow that goes across the political spectrum and on both sides of the aisle, called the Defense Department?
I think the stomach is there, but it's going to be a challenge to get to that point. We have only a couple of Republicans, Senators Colburn, Senators Paul, that have said that we do need to make substantive cuts. But when you have virtually the entire GOP freak out at spending cuts that really don't even put us below Bush's spending because they're not on defense, because they're not paying attention, then it shows that the stomach may be there, but it's not quite.
All right, Nancy, you know that I did not defend, Freedom Watch did not defend the spending under the Bush years. You've heard me rant and rave about this. You know I've criticized severely the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yes.
So can you address this without it being a Republican versus Democrat issue? Stated differently, same question. Is there the stomach in this Congress and this White House to cut the Defense Department budget in a meaningful way?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, Judge. I am actually going to quote a Hoover Fellow Institute, so you know it's a new day.
All right.
Who said that conservatives really should be hearkening back to the Eisenhower tradition of saying that our military power is fundamentally premised on our economic power, and they should go back to that tradition and say, look, we can't be strong militarily unless we cut this budget, and you have to cut the budget. And you know what? It's the fear factor. It's the rhetoric of one penny cut means your national security is at risk, and that is patently absurd, Judge. From personnel costs to do we need that many boots on the ground in Europe to the fact that there's only 50 to 100 or Al-Qaeda in Iraq and 400 or in Afghanistan and 400 in Iraq.
Are you the same Nancy Skinner that's on here every week, or are you an imposter that looks like that liberal Democrat?
Okay. To that point, when you said that Obama is spending more on the military, that's excluding the wars. So that's like doing your household budget and saying you're going to leave out your mortgage and your car payments.
Right,
okay?
exactly.
Bush spent way more because of the wars.
Okay,
but added in and.
All right. You're back to the
So
partisanship.
I am me, Judge. I am me.
All right. Stay the way
I'm
you
not
are.
an imposter.
Now, you and I, Charles, you and I talk about this all the time on Varney and Company, and that's the issue of debt. When Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Admiral Mullen were asked separately, what is the greatest danger to our national security? They didn't say al-Qaeda.
Right.
They said debt.
Right.
Doesn't that tell you that even within the administration itself, the Secretary of State and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, they know we have to stop spending? Can we cut defense?
Unless everyone gets rid of the sacred cows, it's nuts. And, you know, and to the new Nancy made the point, although with all due respect, it's more than $1 million question, right? It could be the question of the solvency of this country. I don't know. I can't speak from the political side, but I think it must be done. It has to be done because we need draconian cuts across the board.
All right, $78 billion over the next 10 years is nothing.
That's nothing
compared to the size of this budget.
That is absolutely nothing. I mean, you have politicians who are forcing military hardware down the throats of generals. Generals are saying, hey, I don't need that particular plane. This is crazy. You can't talk about responsibility and then defend this at the same time.
Do the basic laws of economics go out the window when it comes to the Defense Department?
Well, I think that when it comes to Secretary Gates, he's talked about, we need cuts, but with the actual cuts that he's proposed, it seems like it has gone out the window. What I think that we need to frame this issue completely differently. It's not a matter of trying to find another $300 billion cuts, 500 billion cuts. We need to pick out specific programs. Do we need 11 aircraft carriers? Do we
need 900 military installations around the world?
Yeah, do we need to be in Europe and in Asia in the same proportions? If we can start picking out the specific things and looking at them and having those debates, we can carve away much more of the defense.
Nancy, to your wheelhouse, does the president not have allies on the left in the Congress and elsewhere that would give him comfort when he called for cuts in the Defense Department? Or has he sort of changed his attitude about defense because he's now the commander-in-chief?
I'm sure he has allies on his side of the aisle. Absolutely. The peacetime dividend, that's what Clinton used in a lot of ways to help cut back without any, we had no national security threats. When that happened, Dick Cheney and Colin Powell bragged about cutting defense 25% after the Cold War. So certainly the progressives and liberals would stand behind the president if he said, we're only going to cut out what is redundant and unnecessary for national security. It's a no-brainer, Judge.
Got it. Before we go to the next topic, can we pay the debt and run the government without raising the debt ceiling?
I think we can. I think Secretary Geithner has enough maneuverability to buy us months and months so that we do the tough decisions that we ultimately got to make anyway.
All right. Would you help me meet Varney in an alley? Beat him up until he comes to that deck.
We're going to need a long weekend to get that one done.
All right. Thank you. Changing topics, guys. Tyranny in Egypt. Egyptians are taking to the streets to overthrow their president, demanding a real democracy. But the Egyptian government wants no part of this. It shut down the internet. It terminated mobile phone service. It imposed curfews. What's happening right now in Egypt, and even what happened in Tunisia last week, would not have happened without the internet, which is why the greatest hope for freedom in the world has always been the free flow of ideas. Nancy, to you first. Should we be supporting the people rioting in the streets because Hosni Mubarak is an Arab dictator, or should we fear that whoever would replace him would be even more repressive than he is?
We should do nothing. And we've learned this lesson so many times. Bush 1 supported the people in Iraq for a revolution, and it didn't happen. And then there was great repression, and there was blowback, as they say in CIA terms, about that. You know what? I always have said, Judge, I agree with you. Invade the country with communication waves, not troops. We want to make sure that whoever emerges through back channels supports our accord with Israel and will support us in the world economic development and our development, but not publicly. These people are acting on their own.
All right, got it, Nancy. How effective can the government be in shutting down the internet? I mean, can they curtail all electronic communication, or does something, maybe Twitter or text messaging, get through?
I think they can control it all. But listen, there have been revolutions before the internet, too. It's definitely speeded them up, recently hastened them. But, there's some embedded problems there. And one of the problems, in my mind, is we're seeing what happens with a government that coddles, that creates a dictatorial nanny state where they subsidize food and energy for decades and they create no real true economic opportunities for people.
Should we do nothing? Do you agree with my liberal Democrat on the panel?
Absolutely. We shouldn't do anything here. If you look at the way the Mubarak government has ruled, it's basically been martial law for a long time. We can't ally ourselves with him and try to shut down. We shouldn't be. We shouldn't be allying ourselves with Mubarak and try to help him shut down a revolution. At the same time, we shouldn't necessarily support there to be a revolution, because the Muslim Brotherhood is just as capable of stepping in and actually winning a revolution as moderates. The best hope for Egypt are free and fair, clear elections. We can have the United Nations perhaps participate in trying to ensure. I don't know that that's necessarily going to work, but it can't be the United States. It has to be democracy.
Nancy, you are going to lose your reputation in one show. My True North Libertarian is agreeing with you on this. The conservative Republicans are agreeing with you. Rand Paul is agreeing with you. What does the government really do? I mean, does President Obama get on the phone and say to Hosni Mubarak, hunker down? I can't support these people in public, and I can't support you in public? Or do we literally do nothing?
I think literally do nothing. We have troops in Sinai Peninsula. We have troops there, and we can't, the outcome is too serious.
Got it. Okay. Skinner, Randazzo, Payne, it's a pleasure. Thank you for joining. Thank you, Nancy. Thanks for joining us. Up next, the plain truth on the president's two-faced spending and debt proclamations. Does the government work for us, or do we work for the government? Is the Constitution the law of the land, or can the federal government do anything it wants with our freedoms? Tonight, the government the Constitution, and the patience of the people. We all just endured a monumental week here in the Northeast. Tonight, there are huge piles of snow in and around New York City, some as large as 15 feet tall, some still in the roadways and intersections, and at least one big pile still on the floor of the House of Representatives. I speak, of course, of the snow job the president pulled off on Tuesday night with his State of the Union date night speech, during which members of Congress so strategically and foolishly positioned themselves throughout the House chamber that no matter what the president said, it looked like everyone was cheering. What did he say? He didn't say he wants to spend less. He didn't say he wants to shrink the government. He didn't say he's concerned about the debt. He does want to borrow another $1.5 trillion and waste it on matters not even lawfully within the power of the federal government, matters that his environmental and union and government workforce buddies will just love. Just 2.5 months ago, at the November congressional elections, the president and his party took a shellacking, his word, at the polls. Did he learn anything? Apparently not. This past week, we also learned that the president's spending plans already assumed that the Congress will let him borrow another $1.5 trillion, borrowing power that, of course, he does not yet have. Last night here on Freedom Watch, we learned that Karl Rove advised President Bush that he should borrow $2 trillion in his final 2 years in office. What's wrong with these people? Don't they understand basic economics? Don't they know that every dollar the government borrows is one fewer dollar for private investment? Don't they know that the government has never produced wealth? It can only consume it, that wealth can only be produced by the private sector? Don't these constitution-ignoring big government types in both parties realize that all the borrowed money will need to be paid back, and much of that will come in the form of higher taxes on generations of Americans as yet unborn? They don't understand that. George Bush spent more wildly than any president since LBJ, and Barack Obama will have spent more in 3 years than George Bush did in 8. And only the Tea Party folks in Congress see anything wrong with that. This week also brought us serious riots in Cairo, Egypt, the oldest political capital of any country in history. Unfortunately, the dictator who runs Egypt, President Hosni Mubarak, behaves more like a pharaoh than a president. The opposition is outlawed, the leaders are arrested, its demonstrators are beaten and murdered. All this comes just 1 week after the dictatorial government in Tunisia fell to a popular uprising. America, people know when they have had enough. Even people accustomed to generations, centuries of lost freedom in the Middle East understand that. Back here in the U.S., we have had enough. More than half of the states have asked federal judges to invalidate Obamacare, and 6 of those states are trying to outlaw it themselves. The president has granted over 730 waivers to Obamacare. And just this past week, that permits millions of folks to escape the burdens of this federal control of health care. Well, what about the rest of us? What kind of a law lets the president allow folks out of complying with it? And how can the government decide against whom to enforce this awful law and who to let off the hook? This is not the rule of law, it's the rule of politicians. What to do? Keep watching Freedom Watch, because it is our mission to expose the government, warts and all, no matter who is in charge. Employ your representatives in Congress to vote against letting the president borrow more money. And oh, watch those Republicans. They were elected to shrink the government. Let's watch them and see if they mean what they say. From New York, defending freedom every night of the week. Good night, America.